German officers never suspected America secretly negotiated with Nazis during the war. That is the promise of this story. And tonight, we open the door. Picture the winter of 1945, the Alps buried in ice. Rifle barrels turning white in the breath of men who expect one more hopeless order, while artillery thunders in the valleys, far away. In a warm room in neutral Switzerland, a German SS general pours coffee for an American spy. Here is your first hard fact. On March 8, 1945, secret talks began in Bern that would lead to the surrender of more than 900,000 German troops in Italy. Without most German commanders in the field even knowing such talks existed, one handshake in a quiet apartment, one name spoken in a whisper. And yet, if the wrong officer learned of it, the men in that room would be executed. So tell me, how do you buy peace before the war is over, and keep it hidden from those doing the fighting? Tonight, we follow the trail of the invisible armistice. The deal the front lines never saw. The negotiation that could have changed how the war ended. The question is simple. Who knew? Who didn't? And why? The letter with no sender. The train slid into Bern just before dawn, its iron wheels whispering across frosted rails as if the city itself had asked for quiet. The porter shrugged into his coat and opened the carriage door to a man who did not look like a spy. He was short, neat, forgettable, the kind of face no one could swear to in a lineup. He stepped down with a single leather case, glanced once at the pale ridge of the Gurten Hill, and disappeared into the crowd before anyone could mark what direction he'd taken. He had crossed borders without a stamp. He had carried no pistol, only paper, and the paper was heavier than any weapon. He walked city streets still washed with night, the gas lamps paling as a sleepy sun felt its way into the sky. A bakery door opened. Yeast and heat rolled out, then the door shut again, a small hush returning to the cobbled lane. Up the hill, past shuttered windows and bicycles chained to poles, the man counted his steps. He reached a building where the curtains never moved, where the concierge always pretended not to notice who came and went. And he pressed a bell that was never rung twice. On the third floor, Alan Dulles poured coffee and did not look up until the door clicked shut. He had the same posture behind his desk that he had adopted behind a chessboard as a boy. Chin low, eyes slightly amused, as if each visitor brought him a problem that had already been solved. He listened to the quiet of the room, which always told him more than the mouths of men. And he thought, as he sometimes did at this hour, of how strange it was to arrange pieces in a war you never fired. The courier set the case on the desk, undid two clasps, and slid out a single envelope. No seal, no sender. Only a blank face that could mean nothing and everything. Dulles did not touch it at once. He warmed his hands around his cup first, feeling the thin heat seep into his fingers, and studied the corners of the envelope the way a jeweler studies a stone. Finally, he slid it open with a blade that had been used for the same purpose a dozen times, drew out one page, and began to read. He read it once through without pausing, from the careful greeting to the final, almost offhand signature. He read it a second time, and the muscles at the sides of his jaw tightened. He read parts of it a third time, lips moving slightly, but making no sound. When he finished, he looked past the paper to the man who had carried it, and nodded to a chair. The courier remained standing. Dulles did not take offense. He set the page down, then struck a match. The edge of the letter blackened. A flame crawled along the fiber, first thin, then bright, then hungry, curling the paper upon itself until it fell inward like a dying leaf. In less than a minute, there was no letter, only ash, and the heavy meaning of what it had said, which could not be burned. There are first contacts that come like thunder, and there are first contacts that arrive like a single footstep in snow. This was the latter. It had been written by a man who would not sign his true name, a man who could stand in a room full of officers and never be guessed at. He offered what no one on the Allied side expected to receive from an SS general, a path to surrender in Italy. Not tomorrow, not next week, but soon. If the conversation stayed invisible, and if the Americans swore one thing, the Soviets must not be told. Outside, A tram bell rang, sliding through the morning like a coin across glass. Dulles rubbed the ash between his thumb and forefinger, fine as smoke, and asked one question. Who, precisely, was the German? The courier had been told very little, which was the only way to keep him alive on the way back. The man was tall. He wore his uniform loosely, as if it bored him. He had a face that could smile without becoming friendly. He outranked men who killed for a living, but killed rarely himself. And he had a habit of avoiding mirrors, as if the reflection might accuse him. Dulles already knew. He did not say the name aloud, even here, even now. He said something else, something easier to forget. The Americans had a condition of their own. The man who made the offer would have to prove he could deliver. Names of units, positions, supplies, and if he lacked the power, then the conversation was over, and no one on the hill above Bern had ever met anyone in this room. The courier nodded. He had done his work. He lifted the empty case, bowed by the width of a hair, and left. Dulles watched the door close. Then he stood and went to the window, where a thin line of winter light laced the rooftops. Below, the city began to wake. Swans were drawing white lines across the green water of the Ari. Men were unlocking bicycles. Somewhere, a clock struck 8. Dulles thought of the men under fire on the other side of the mountains, clinging to ridgelines with the world falling apart around them. They kept listening for orders that would never come, because the orders, if they came, would not be sent by radio. He had been in Bern since 1942, and if you asked anyone in town what he did, they would say the same thing. He is a diplomat. He attends dinners. He is fond of cigars. He reads the Times a week late, and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung first thing. He has a scar on his hand, shaped like a comma. They would not have mentioned the people who arrived with no names, the messages that were burned, the maps with small pencil crosses in the places where men could be made to talk, and they would not have mentioned the fact that Switzerland, neutral in public, was a marketplace in private, where information was currency, and every purchase came with a receipt no one wanted to sign. Dulles left the window. He moved back to the desk and took out a fresh page. He wrote 3 lines in a hand that looked careless and was not. Then he folded it, sealed it, and pressed a stamp into the wax that bore no crest. The letter would travel hours to reach a woman who did not work for him, but who knew how to find a priest who did. The priest visited a monastery where a man sang poorly and drank too much beer on Fridays. The man knew a hotel porter, who knew a chauffeur, who knew an adjutant who could, if paid enough, and promised even more, get a slip of paper to a general who had been waiting all winter to feel clever by the time the chain finished. The courier had crossed back into a country where the border guards loved paperwork and glassy smiles. The night train clattered past small stations. Snow flurried in the dim platform lamps and melted on the cheeks of women, who stood in boots to say goodbye to men they would not see again. Tickets were checked. Lamps were lowered. The courier said nothing. When he finally closed his eyes, it was not sleep. It was something harder. A decision not to be noticed. The letter that burned in Bern had not been the first whisper of surrender on this front. For months there had been rumors, tendrils of smoke without a visible fire, that someone in the German chain of command wanted out of the pyre, spiraling through northern Italy. The Gothic line had eaten armies, and the mountains were a meat grinder with stones for teeth. German soldiers were veterans. They knew what was coming. Not a miracle, not a reversal, only the long-last hunger of a war that had lost its appetite for them. They fought because they were told to fight. They kept fighting because no one told them to stop. There is a point in every war when the map becomes a lie. Lines on paper say, hold, but the ground says fall back. Headquarters say reinforce, but the men say we are already ghosts. In those weeks, that is what northern Italy felt like. The Americans, the British, the Brazilians, the partisans, all pushing north. The Germans, calculating, every day, fewer shells. Every day, more white flags lying under blankets like contraband. Every day, a general in an office looking at a telephone that he hoped would ring and feared would ring with the same desperate heartbeat. So, in a room with blackout curtains on a quiet street, A man whose name we will not yet speak, and a man whose name we cannot forget, arranged to meet in Switzerland. The risk was not the meeting. The risk was the echo. If the wrong ear caught even the shape of a rumor, the entire mountain range could explode from inside. Germany had punishments for men who talked to the enemy. They were efficient punishments. They needed little rope. It is time for our first payoff, and yes, it comes with a name. The American at the chessboard in Bern is not merely a diplomat. He is the spine of a new American intelligence, and his name is Alan Dulles. The German who is reaching for him, quietly, carefully, is not merely a soldier. He is SS General Karl Wolff, Himmler's liaison, and a master of survival. Between them lies a bargaining table no one has set, in a country that insists no bargaining table exists at all. If this hidden history grips you, if the thought of a deal made behind the guns pulls you into the room, stay with me. Subscribe, share this story with a friend who loves the shadows of a map, and keep your eyes on the door. We are only at the threshold. Back in Bern, the day bled forward. Dulles opened his office to the routine traffic that protected the unusual from view. A banker arrived to talk about exchange rates. A journalist from a neutral capital asked an idle question whose answer he already knew. A Swiss colonel came to measure the American's posture, politely, on behalf of no one he could admit to serving. The ash cooling in the tray said nothing, yet every conversation moved around it, as water moves around a stone. The man who spoke for Berlin, but not to Berlin, he drove at night with the lights hooded. The Apennines crouched like sleeping animals on either side of the road. The staff car smelled faintly of wet wool and tobacco. In the back seat, Karl Wolff kept his hands on his hat as if the felt itself might betray a tremor. The driver watched him in the mirror once, then remembered not to do it again. Outside, ruined farmhouses appeared and vanished. A mule brayed somewhere in the dark as if arguing with the moon. Wolff was not afraid of the road. He was afraid of the wrong pair of eyes. Men in his own uniform could end him faster than any partisan. A single question asked in the wrong corridor. A single note folded into the wrong pocket. He forced his jaw to unclench and looked out at the black seams of mountain. There was a word for what he was doing, and it was not treason, not to him. It was survival, and survival was the most honest creed he had ever found. He reached Verona before dawn. In a courtyard behind a shuttered hotel, he stepped out into a breath-frozen white. A young adjutant hurried to take his coat, failed to hide the quick glance at the collar tabs, and led him into a room where the curtains were drawn and a map of northern Italy covered the wall like a second skin. Lamps hummed. Coffee hovered in the air, but did not quite amount to warmth. A colonel with careful hair traced a finger along the Gothic line and cleared his throat. Reports from Parma. The colonel said, "Pressure, here and here. If the Americans attempt to push along the highway, they will." Wolff said, "Not to argue, but because facts cost nothing." The colonel swallowed. "Then we fall back in 2 stages. If command allows." "If command allows," Wolff repeated, and felt the room flinch, almost imperceptibly, as if a cold hand had brushed the back of every neck. After the briefing, the colonel waited as the others filed out. He lingered by the map, then stepped closer, lower voice, eyes to candid. "Herr General, there are rumors. There always are. These are specific." A meeting in Switzerland, with Americans. Silence folded the room. Somewhere beyond the wall, a door closed softly, an apology of wood and air. Wolff held the colonel's gaze long enough to turn courage into discomfort. "Do you know what happens to men who pass along rumors?" Wolff asked. "They become careful," the colonel said, "and it might have been bravery. Or it might have been youth." Wolff let the corner of his mouth move, the smallest permission. "Be careful, then, and ensure the telephone logs show nothing unusual this week." The colonel nodded, dismissed himself, and the note of it lodged under Wolff's ribs. There was always someone listening. If not the colonel, then the colonel's clerk. If not the clerk, then the maid who emptied the wastebasket and had a brother in the Wehrmacht who had a friend who owed a favor to a man in black. He exhaled, slow, and reached for the other life he carried. The one hidden inside the first like a folded letter dot. At mid-morning he asked for the car again. Not toward the front, but south. To a city that had learned to bow and keep its doors unlocked for anyone who wore the right boots. The cathedral bell in Milan sounded like a warning passed through a throat that had been bruised. Wolf went not to the cathedral, but to a side street near the canal where a doorway had been painted, a shade of green that did not appear anywhere in nature. He knocked once. A priest opened the door holding a book by its spine. "You are late," the priest said, which in that house meant he was right on time. "God has never minded waiting," Wolf said. The priest's smile was brief. He led the general through a quiet hallway to a parlor where a small, precise man with a diplomat's com was already seated under a painting of a saint who had died badly. The man's cufflinks were modest. His shoes were perfectly polished. He offered neither name nor hand, only a chair and the soft kindness of one who has made careers by noticing what others miss. "You can move 3 divisions. The diplomat murmured, "The way a doctor says the word fever, not to panic, but to confirm. You can also make them freeze where they stand." "I can make some of them freeze," Wolf said. "Not all. Never all. And the airfields, if they are not crated first. And the telephone exchange in Verona. It will ring as long as I ask it to, and no longer." The diplomat considered. "Our friend in Bern asks for a gesture to show good faith. I have given him lists. Lists are paper. Paper is smoke. He wants something that stings." Wolf's eyes slid to the painting, then back. "I will loosen the rope around the partisans for 48 hours. No sweeps. No night raids. Let them breathe. Word will travel." "Good," the diplomat said. "And the other matter?" Wolf didn't move, but the room felt him lean toward danger. "If this works, I will need guarantees. Not for my house. For my skin. You will be useful," the diplomat said, which was neither yes nor no, and everything in between. They parted without the formalities men once believed kept the world from cracking. In the hallway, the priest closed the book and whispered a name that was not a blessing. One of those old men in Rome who never admitted to knowing what they knew. Wolf nodded and stepped back into the day as if rising from underwater. A woman pushed a prom past him with a child, asleep under a blanket stitched with blue squares. The general could not look at the child for more than a heartbeat. It was too clean a thing. On the road north, they passed a truck convoy in the opposite lane. The canvas flaps were tied down. From inside, muffled voices, "Prisoners, or replacements, or potatoes." The driver stared straight ahead. Wolf stared straight ahead. That is how wars pass each other when they are nearly done. A report waited in Verona. A partisan ambush on the Lake Road. A lieutenant, dead in the first volley, neat hole through the cap badge. Wolf read the sheet twice, and pressed his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose. He had promised a gesture. He could not promise peace. He sent a signal anyway. Patrols pulled back. Villagers took a long, cautious breath, as if testing whether the air had changed. It had, a little. News moved like water, seeking the lowest place. That night, in Bern, Dulles touched a match to a note from Milan, and watched the flame curl and eat. The words had already done their work before they turned to ash. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and a map unfurled on the inside of his lids. Brushed by ghostly arrows he did not trust, and names he did. He would push for more. A place, a date. A name on a line under a word that meant nothing until men with rifles put their barrels to the dirt and looked up. In Moscow. A different piece of paper, clapped under a different hand. Separate conversations in Switzerland, the report said. American duplicity. The man who read it had a scar on his cheek that twisted when he smiled. He did not smile. He wrote 3 sentences, none of them gentle, and sent them sliding down a corridor where the air itself seemed to hold a grudge. Back in Italy, Wolf stepped into a room where a radio sighed on a table and 2 officers argued in low voices about how much dynamite could collapse a mountain tunnel. They stopped when he entered. He lifted his hand. "We keep the tunnel," he said. "We may need it." The officers glanced at each other, then at the general's face, and swallowed their questions like hard pills. He slept for an hour in a chair with his boots on. and woke to the scrape of paper under the door. He bent, picked it up, and felt the small shock of seeing his own name written in a hand he recognized too well. The letter was from Himmler. It did not say much. It never did. It was a string pulled taut, a reminder that the man in Berlin could feel the itch of every movement 1,000 kilometers away. Wolf burned it in an ashtray, and watched the black edge climb. The firelight made a brief halo of his fingers. When the ash fell in on itself, he shook the tray gently, as if persuading a reluctant insect to move along. He stood, crossed to the window, and opened the shutters a notch. Morning was lifting the roofs like eyelids. Somewhere, a baker stacked loaves. Somewhere, a child cried with nothing to do with strategy. He let the air lay a hand on his face and closed the shutters again. The next meeting with Dulles could not happen in the same room. The pattern was already dangerous. He would cross by a different route. He would let another man arrive first and leave last. The car took him to a small station, where the ticket agent did not look at faces, only at fares. The train hissed, sighed, accepted him. The compartment smelled of coal, and something sweet that had spilled and dried between the seats. He sat with his back to the engine, because he did not like to watch where he was going. It was a habit he had learned far too late. The Swiss frontier came like an exhale. Guards with the particular politeness of men who can ruin you with a stamp. Papers, a nod. The click of a hinge. The train moved again, softer now, as if relieved to be in a country that pretended to be unmarked by the war it profited from. Wolf watched a boy on a platform point at the locomotive and announce something to his mother. She laughed and wiped his nose with the corner of her scarf. The general felt old. He reached a lakeside town with steep streets and shutters painted in colors that had outlived empires. The appointment was for evening. He had hours to kill. He walked along the water with his hat low and his gaze lower, counting stones in the breakwater instead of men who might be following. At a bench near a sycamore, a newspaper lay folded to a page about an opera singer engaged to a banker. He sat. He did not pick up the paper. He watched a boat make a thin V in the water. He told himself he could still turn around. The room with 2 doors and no exit. The knock was too calm to belong to danger, and too precise to belong to safety. Dulles froze. Wolf turned slightly, enough to catch the American's expression, and saw that same flicker. A man who'd just realized the board had changed and he hadn't moved a single piece. The door opened without permission. A figure stepped inside, rain dripping from the brim of a hat. The kind of entrance that belonged to someone who never expected to be stopped. The uniform underneath the coat was German, but not Wolf's. A colonel? Younger, the face too smooth for the eyes it carried. "Forgive the intrusion, Herr General," he said in German, his tone balanced between deference and suspicion. "I was told you were in Switzerland on Himmler's orders, and yet," his gaze slid toward Dulles, "I find you keeping strange company." For a heartbeat, the room forgot how to breathe. Dulles said nothing, his hand resting near a folder that could be mistaken for an afterthought. Wolf stepped forward slowly, not reaching for his weapon. He didn't need to. The danger here wasn't bullets. It was words. "Colonel," Wolf said softly, "you've seen too much." "Perhaps," the colonel replied, "or perhaps not enough. You should know, the Reich Security Office has questions about your travels. I volunteered to find the answers." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend light. Then Dulles, almost lazily, set his glass down and said in careful, accented German, "If your superiors knew what your general is arranging, they might shoot him first. And you, second." The colonel blinked, thrown off balance for the smallest fraction of a second. Wolf caught it, then moved. He took one step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that could have cut glass. "You will go back," Wolf said, "and tell them nothing. You saw no one. You heard nothing. You will live longer that way." The colonel's mouth opened, then closed. His pulse showed in his neck like a clock trying to keep time. "If they suspect, they already suspect," Wolf interrupted. "The only question is who dies first. Don't make it you." The colonel hesitated, then gave the smallest nod, the kind that means surrender without admitting it. He turned, left the room, and his footsteps vanished down the corridor like a fuse burning out. Wolf waited until he was sure the silence was real again. Then he looked at Dulles. "You see now why this must end quickly," he said. Dulles nodded once. "It will, but not the way you think." They parted with no handshake this time, only an unspoken acknowledgement that both men were already ghosts walking among the living. Wolf returned to Italy the next day under a name that didn't belong to him, while Dulles began sending cables that had no destination and yet reached every office that mattered by late March. Word of talks in Switzerland had seeped into corners no secrecy could reach. In Moscow, Stalin slammed his fist onto a desk and accused the Americans of betrayal. In London, Churchill tried to calm the storm with careful words that fooled no one. The world was fracturing even before the war was done. And in the middle of it all, Alan Dulles sat in a smoke-filled office in Bern, staring at a map of Italy pinned with colored threads. He had been told to keep the Soviets informed. He had not. The cables from Washington said nothing about peace. They spoke of delay, verification, deniability. Dulles had begun to understand that secrets were not what kept wars alive. It was the lies told to protect them. Across the Alps, Karl Wolf's world was unraveling faster than he could patch it. Rumors spread through the ranks. Officers began to vanish, some reassigned, others quietly executed. Himmler sent messages laced with concern that sounded like threats. "Your loyalty," he wrote, "must be proven by actions, not by absence." Wolf stared at that line for a long time, the ink shimmering in candlelight. Actions, not absence. He knew exactly what it meant. Somewhere in Berlin, a clerk had already drawn a red line through his name. He summoned his aide that night. A young lieutenant, with eyes too honest for the world they were in. "Burn the correspondence," Wolf said. "All of it." The lieutenant hesitated. "Even those marked for the Reichswehr. Especially those." By morning, the air in his quarters reeked of smoke and fear. Yet the documents were gone, reduced to ash just like the first letter Dulles had burned weeks before. Two men on opposite sides of a dying empire, joined by a single ritual of fire. When Wolf crossed back into Switzerland days later, he was thinner, quieter. His uniform hung loose. Dulles noticed the tremor in his hands as they sat once more, the curtains drawn. The lake outside motionless as steel. "It must be now," Wolf said. "Every day we wait, another 1,000 die for nothing." Dulles didn't disagree, but his eyes narrowed. "You realize, if Washington refuse, if Moscow exposes this, neither of us walks away." "Then let's walk quickly," Wolf said. The next hours unfolded like a series of loaded dice thrown in slow motion. Names were spoken. Units marked for surrender. Codes exchanged that could be denied later. The operation had a name, now a fitting irony, Dulles thought, for something born in darkness. But before any sunrise comes the longest night in Berlin. The whispers reached Himmler at last. Someone close to Wolf had talked. A driver, perhaps. Or the colonel who had knocked on that door. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that a message arrived on Himmler's desk sealed in black wax. "Wolf is speaking with the Americans." The Reichswehr's hand trembled, not with rage but calculation. He needed a scapegoat before the Führer heard. If he could control Wolf's betrayal, perhaps he could bargain his own. Himmler began drafting a letter to neutral parties about peace, about reason, about saving Germany from ruin. He believed he could outplay the Allies and his own men at once. He was wrong, but not yet. Back in Bern, the deal was reaching its razor's edge. Dulles wired Washington for authorization to proceed. Hours passed. Then, a reply came, not approval, not denial. Only a sentence that said everything and nothing. Proceed with utmost discretion. The president is aware. He knew what that meant. If it succeeded, it would be the president's victory. If it failed, it would be Dulles's crime. The final meeting was set in a small house outside Zurich. Wolf arrived, disguised as a businessman. The guards who shadowed him didn't know they were guarding a man who was about to surrender their own army. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil lamps and nervousness. Dulles greeted him with a tired smile. "This is the moment," he said quietly. Wolf nodded, and his voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. Then let history forget me quickly, he signed. A single name, a tremor in ink. The war in Italy would end weeks before Berlin fell. Nearly 1 million German soldiers would lay down their arms because of a signature that could not exist. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. The wind rattled the shutters as if echoing the drums of a distant parade. The two men stood for a moment in that quiet house, listening to a world, trying to remember what peace sounded like. And then Dulles said something that would haunt Wolf forever. You understand, General? They will never thank you for this. I don't need thanks, Wolf said. I only need to live long enough to see who lies about it first. He left before dawn, disappearing into a country that had mastered the art of forgetting. Dulles stayed behind, watching the lake shift from black to grey. Sunrise, he thought, but it didn't feel like one. 2 days later, the story broke not the truth, but a rumor, twisted by distance. The Soviets called it treachery. The British called it arrogance. The Americans called it progress. And somewhere, in a prison cell near Verona, the young colonel who had once knocked on a door sat with a pistol on the table, waiting for orders that would never come. The surrender was done. The war almost over, but in the quiet corners of Europe, new wars were already waking. And in Bern, Alan Dulles opened a telegram stamped "Confidential Eyes Only." It contained one line that changed everything. Stalin demands full disclosure of Operation Sunrise. Moscow suspects collusion. Prepare for fallout. Dulles folded the telegram carefully, lit another match, and whispered into the smoke. Then the next war has already begun. The surrender nobody heard the night before the end came. The mountains were louder than the guns. Snowmelt dripped from black stones, and the valleys echoed with the last meaningless orders of men who still believed the war had rules. In a bunker outside Lake Garda, German officers smoked in silence, their faces pale in lamplight, their maps smeared with ash. None of them knew that their war was already over, far away. In a quiet villa, guarded by Swiss neutrality and American discretion, Alan Dulles held the paper that ended it. It was thin, creased, signed in haste, and so dangerous that even the ink felt alive. Operation Sunrise had succeeded. But Dulles didn't smile. He knew the price wasn't measured in lives saved, it was measured in secrets buried. The telegram from Moscow still sat unopened on his desk. He had read it already, but something in him refused to accept its weight. Stalin was furious. The Soviets claimed betrayal, insisting America had cut a separate deal with the Nazis behind their backs. To Stalin, it was proof the West had never been an ally only, a temporary convenience. Dulles poured a measure of whiskey, the glass trembling slightly in his hand, and thought of all the men who would die because of this one act of peace. Across the Alps, Karl Wolff drove south with the curtains drawn, escorted by guards who didn't yet know they were protecting a man branded a traitor in Berlin. He stared at the dark ridgelines sliding past and wondered whether he had saved his soul, or bartered it for one more breath. The war had taught him that survival was a habit that killed slowly. He would soon learn that even surrender had a cost. By April 29, 1945, the secret surrender of German forces in Italy was signed and sealed. A message was sent to London. The enemy in Italy has agreed to unconditional surrender. But it was too clean a phrase for what had really happened, because nothing about that surrender was unconditional. In a small Italian village, Captain Otto Reiner of the 90th Panzergrenadier Division received no orders to cease fire. His men were dug into stone barns and vineyards, facing British artillery that thundered like a heartbeat in the hills. The ceasefire line had been drawn, but no one told the men holding it. When a British patrol approached, waving a white cloth, Reiner's men opened fire. 2 were killed instantly. The war, which had already ended on paper, continued in flesh for 2 more days. In Bern, Dulles stared at the cables flooding in London, demanding confirmation. Washington urging silence, Moscow demanding blood. You cannot keep peace a secret, his aide said quietly. Dulles didn't answer. He knew peace, like war, depended on who controlled the story. And for now, the story was still his to tell or to hide. Meanwhile, In Berlin, Himmler was unraveling. He had heard of Wolff's betrayal. He raged, then plotted, then decided to outdo him. If Wolff could negotiate with the Americans, so could he. Himmler sent his own messenger toward Sweden, offering to surrender all of Germany in the condition that he remain in power to preserve order. When Hitler heard, he flew into a fury so violent it tore through his bunker like a storm. "Betrayal," he hissed, "even from my own." That same night, Wolff's name was whispered in the Reich Chancellery, with the venom reserved for ghosts. The SS was ordered to find him, but by then, he was already out of reach. He sat in a borrowed uniform in a convoy of jeeps, bearing American markings, moving north toward Milan. In the distance, church bells rang not for victory, but for something quieter, stranger. In Milan, partisans dragged Mussolini's broken convoy out of the road. The dictator's fall was a spectacle of revenge. Wolff saw the aftermath with his own eyes. The man who once ruled Italy hung upside down in a square. Crowds spat, screamed, wept. For a moment, Wolff stood frozen. He realized that if the war had lasted another week, that could have been him. By May 2nd, the guns finally fell silent in northern Italy. The German radio frequencies that had once crackled with orders now hummed with static. Allied commanders confirmed the surrender of more than 900,000 Axis troops. The operation that had begun in secret rooms now ended in whispers across fields and ruins. And yet, in the streets of Moscow, newspapers called it a betrayal. In the Kremlin, Stalin's aides read reports aloud. American representatives met with Nazi officials in Switzerland. Each sentence was a dagger, sharpened by suspicion. Stalin turned from the window and said quietly, "The war is not over. The enemy has only changed clothes." When Dulles learned of Stalin's words, he understood what they meant. The next conflict had already begun, and its battlefield would be invisible. The Cold War was breathing beneath the ashes of the last one. Still, there were debts left unpaid. On May 3rd, Wolff was flown to Rome under American custody. He expected chains. Instead, they gave him coffee, cigarettes, and a promise of protection. His cooperation had bought him time. In the official reports, his name was softened. No mention of his role in deportations. No reference to Himmler's inner circle. Only General Karl Wolff, key intermediary in the Italian surrender. But there were people who hadn't forgotten. In the ruined streets of Vienna, survivors whispered his name with rage. In London, intelligence officers debated whether he should stand trial. And in Moscow, the NKVD had already written a file on him 6 inches thick. As Wolff waited in a safe house outside Rome. An American officer handed him a cigarette and said, "You played your part well, General. History will be kinder than Berlin." Wolff stared at the smoke curling in the air. "History has no kindness," he said. "Only witnesses." That night, Dulles received an encrypted message from Washington. It contained no congratulations, only a warning. Expect Soviet retaliation. They will not forgive Sunrise. He folded the note, slipped it into his coat pocket, and went for a walk through the sleeping streets of Bern. The snow had melted. The river ran high and cold, and the city seemed older than truth itself. He wondered whether he had done the right thing. Thousands of lives had been spared, yes, but millions more would soon be drawn into a colder, quieter kind of war. His deal with Wolff had been a victory no one could celebrate. The next morning, a telegram arrived in the Soviet embassy. It was unsigned, written in careful German. "You search for traitors in Berlin. Look west." The Americans made peace with the devil while pretending to fight him. No one ever discovered who sent it. But by the time it reached Stalin's desk, the damage was done. The first seeds of distrust between East and West had already been planted, and they would grow for decades. Meanwhile, in an American intelligence office, Allen Dulles received a sealed envelope marked "Eyes Only." Inside was a single sentence from his superior in Washington: "Destroy all evidence of direct negotiation with SS leadership." He held the paper over the ashtray and hesitated. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of what he had built, the web of lies, the silences, the shadows. Then he struck a match, and once again, The truth turned to smoke. Outside, spring sunlight spilled across the Alps. Cows grazed on meadows that had been silent through months of thunder. The world was trying to forget. But history never forgets, only waits. And somewhere in a quiet house in Zurich, Karl Wolff awoke to a knock on the door. Not soldiers this time. Not Americans. A single man in a dark suit, no insignia, no name. He held out an envelope and said, "From Moscow. They know." Wolff's breath caught. He looked down at the envelope and saw no seal, no return, mark only, a faint hand-drawn symbol in red ink. He recognized it instantly. It was the mark of vengeance. He didn't open it. He didn't need to, because he knew, with absolute certainty, that the war he thought he'd ended had just begun again, in silence. The secret that shaped the silence the war had ended. But the silence it left behind was not pace, it was tension, stretched thin as wire. Europe was a continent, stitched together by secrets. And somewhere among those stitches lay the shadow of Operation Sunrise. The papers were gone, the meetings erased, but whispers still drifted through embassies, cafes, and interrogation rooms. Everyone seemed to know something, just never the same thing, in Washington. Alan Dulles sat in a narrow office that no longer felt like his own. His superiors praised the success of the Italian surrender in measured tones, careful to never mention how it had happened. He'd saved lives, yes, but he'd also lit the first spark of a new war, the kind fought not with armies, but with mistrust. He poured himself coffee that had gone cold hours before and stared at a headline in the New York Times. Stalin accuses allies of secret dealings with Nazis. He had expected anger. He had not expected how fast that anger would harden into policy. Across the ocean, in Moscow, a different kind of meeting was taking place. The air in the Kremlin was heavy with cigarette smoke and suspicion. Stalin sat at the end of a long table, his fingers drumming on the wood. Before him were the reports. From Switzerland, smuggled through channels no one admitted existed. "The Americans negotiated with our enemy," he said quietly. Even while our men were dying on the Oder, he turned to Beria, whose smile never reached his eyes. "Find me proof, or find me someone to blame." And so the hunt began, not for Germans, but for ghosts. Soviet agents in Italy traced every rumor, every letter that hinted at American duplicity. They followed trails that led nowhere, and trails that led straight back to men who thought they were safe. One such man was Karl Wolff. He had been moved. Again, now to a villa near Lake Como, under Allied protection. Officially, he was a cooperative prisoner. In reality, he was leverage an SS general who knew too much about too many deals. He spent his days walking the garden paths, rehearsing his story for whichever tribunal would come first. The Americans promised leniency. The British offered silence. The Soviets, he knew, would offer only a bullet. Sometimes, at night, Wolff dreamed of that first meeting in Bern, the sound of Dulles's calm voice, the flick of the match, the letter curling into ash. He wondered if Dulles ever thought of him now. Perhaps the American was sitting in some tall building, rewriting history, one paragraph at a time. Wolff had learned that power was not the ability to act, it was the privilege of erasing. Then one morning, a new visitor arrived, not an officer, not an interrogator, an American journalist with a press badge and eyes that saw too much. "General Wolff," the man said, smiling as he set down a recorder that wasn't supposed to exist yet. "I'm writing about the surrender in Italy. They say you met the Americans before the war was over. I want to know, who gave you permission?" Wolff's first instinct was silence. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. "Permission," he said. "No one gives permission to men drowning. They simply stop fighting the water." The reporter pressed. "Did you speak for Berlin?" Wolff smiled faintly. No one spoke for Berlin at the end. Berlin had gone deaf. The journalist left with more questions than answers, but the story he wrote weeks later, half rumor, half truth, would find its way across the world. In Moscow, it confirmed every suspicion. In Washington, it caused another round of quiet denials. And in the ruins of Germany, it made Wolff a name worth both protecting and destroying. Meanwhile, Dulles had been called to London for debriefings that were not really debriefings. Men in suits with clipped voices asked about timing, about documents, about witnesses who might talk. He answered every question with precision and calm, except the one they never asked aloud whether he regretted it. He didn't. Regret was for men who believed in purity. Dulles believed in results. Still, there were moments when memory caught him off guard. Once, during a dinner in London, a British officer joked, "So tell me, Alan, did you enjoy your little tea party with the Nazis?" The table laughed. Dulles did not. "No one enjoys tea with the devil," he said quietly. "But sometimes, it's the only way to stop him burning the house down." By the end of 1946, Karl Wolfe was on trial not for war crimes, but for his proximity to them. The Americans ensured his sentence was light. He served a few years in prison, enough to satisfy appearances. When he was released, he disappeared into the West German fog, a man without a past but with too many futures. As for Operation Sunrise, its official files were sealed. But files, like ghosts, never stay buried. By the 1950s, Soviet intelligence had leaked fragments, meeting times, code names, intercepted transmissions. The truth had been twisted, translated, and weaponized. To the east, it proved American treachery. To the west, it proved Soviet paranoia. To the few who actually knew, it proved that the truth was just another casualty of war. In the following years, Dulles rose higher. The world knew him as the man who built America's post-war intelligence machine. The OSS became the CIA, and the same man who once traded secrets in a dim apartment now traded empires from behind an oak desk. Operation Sunrise had taught him one lesson. Wars are never won by armies, only by information. But even he could not control the ghosts forever. In 1958, a package arrived at the American embassy in Rome, no sender. Inside was a single photograph, Dulles and Wolfe, sitting in that first Swiss meeting, captured through a curtain slit. The note beneath it read, "Nothing stays secret." Dulles held the photograph for a long time. Then he burned it, as he had burned so many things before. But the image stayed with him, vivid and unwelcome, a reminder that every secret leaves a shadow. And shadows always move. In Moscow, decades later, an old archivist turned over a sealed envelope marked for the chairman's eyes only. Inside were carbon copies of reports detailing the Bern negotiations. He hesitated, then slipped one page into his pocket before sending the rest to be filed away again. History, he decided, should have witnesses after all. And so the story of the hidden surrender never truly vanished. It lived in whispers among diplomats, in redacted lines of intelligence reports, in the private nightmares of men who had once shaken hands in the dark. The official history said Germany fell because of courage, unity, and fate. The real history said otherwise. It said that a handful of men, American, German, Russian, had carved the end of the war from the bones of deceit. Alan Dulles died years later with medals on his chest, and secrets still sealed in vaults that bore no name. Karl Wolfe lived long, enough to give interviews to journalists who no longer knew how to tell when a man was lying. When asked about his role in the surrender, he smiled and said, "Peace is simply war by other means. We all just changed uniforms." And yet, one detail remains unsolved, the letter that started it all. The one Dulles burned in Bern. No copy was ever found. No sender was ever confirmed. But in 1999, during renovations of an old building in Bern, a workman discovered fragments of paper hidden inside a wall, cavity half burned, but legible in parts. The words read, "If we wait any longer, Germany will belong not to history, but to fire." No signature, no date, just an echo of a decision that changed the shape of the world. Even now, historians argue whether Operation Sunrise was an act of cunning heroism or quiet betrayal. Whether it shortened the war or divided the peace. Whether it proved humanity's hunger for survival or its willingness to compromise with evil. But one truth remains unshakable. The German officers never suspected America had been negotiating with their own before the war was even over. And when they finally learned, it was too late to matter, because history had already been written by men who never asked permission. Somewhere, in a drawer no one opens, a single photograph still survives. Two men in a room full of smoke, shaking hands as the world burned outside. Their faces are calm, their eyes unreadable, and beneath the photos, in faded ink, someone once wrote, "The war ended here. The truth never did."